Thank you everyone for showing up. I really appreciate it. I hope this is of value to you. Um, to give a, so I'm mostly just talking about specific strategies you can utilize online um, to promote active learning. That said, a lot of what I'm talking about is backed by research that was conducted on the ground. So it's not exclusive to online, but I think it becomes especially important to engage in these techniques online when passive learning is a bit more difficult on an online platform. That said, most of this webinar is passive learning. The irony is not lost upon me. But my sense is simply, at least when I go to a webinar, I just kind of want the information and I want to get out of there. I'm projecting my own beliefs onto you. Sorry about that if that's not how you roll, but that's kind of what this is going to be. To give you a agenda of kind of what we're going to talk about, I'm just going to kind of go over kind of the base, why even care about active learning, what is it? After that, I'm going to go over what a flipped classroom is, which is a structural change you can make. And then within that, what ends up happening is you end up having more discussions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to promote group discussions. And then another technique that they can use is problem-based learning. And then at the end, there are resources, some pretty good ones, I think, for active learning activities. And there's one specifically, which I really like, which I got from the PFF class actually, which gives you specific activities across a range of disciplines. So I'd highly suggest, and I'll point that out at the end, but I'd highly suggest looking at that. While this is mostly passive learning, I'm talking about very specific techniques, and I personally have not taught online this past semester, so I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. So I was wondering if anyone who has been sitting in on online classes, either teaching or as a student, if anyone would like to share what made them engaging or disengaging. And you can use the chat function if that's more comfortable for you, or speak, whatever you want to do. Yeah, so does anyone have anything they'd like to share?
I can share something that um, made me kind of more engaged. I think something that was already like brought up was group discussions. A lot of the times when we did like kind of Zoom sessions, it was great to have the classroom engaged with the professors. For example, in my lactation counseling class, we had to be engaged with each other and having to figure out how to do kind of like breakout groups and then tie it back around to the other groups and the professors was really nice. So having that kind of space to talk to your classmates and professors separately and together was pretty nice.
Okay, that's great to hear. Someone else said the instructor posed interesting problems. So based on what Caleb and Sarah said, we're actually going to be discussing so how to give problems to students and how to foster kind of better group discussions. So I think my sense is this might be helpful and might relate to those experiences you've had so far. Um, so to that point, I'm just going to show, I've kind of littered this webinar with a few videos that explain things better than I can. So the first of which is the benefits of active learning. I think it's 3 to 5 minutes. So we're just going to quickly watch this and I'll come back after.
I've come to learn that active learning is a way of engaging with the material in a way that entrains the information in your memory systems much more effectively than the superficial memorization with which we tend to approach these concepts.
I'm convinced that active learning is good for students and helps them learn. We documented improved performance in students that were engaged in active learning as compared to their peers in a more traditional learning space.
The study that I find most persuasive is by Mark Freeman, published in 2014. It's a meta-study of over 200 different studies looking at the failure rates where active learning was present or when active learning wasn't present. They found that the likelihood of a student failing a course is 1.5 times more when the course does not contain active learning.
I think it really works. My teaching evaluations have gone way up. My B's have gone way up, and I've grabbed that tail where my C's have dropped and the number of D's and F's and folks withdrawing from my class has dropped significantly.
We also see improved performance based on students' incoming ACTs. And we see increased attendance.
We know, like the Friedman meta-analysis, it showed that students from first generation or from underrepresented minorities, those are the ones who benefit the most from active learning. So if you really want to reach all students in your classroom, that's one thing I would recommend, right? Use active learning, there's a tool.
It has changed me dramatically as a teacher. Doing these kinds of projects stimulates me, and the dynamics every time are completely different because of who the students are. So it's highly invigorating as a teacher to be in these.
I'm not sure that for everybody, active learning is the one and only way. I will say that for me, I have found significant increases in engagement when students are actively working towards something because they're in progress around discovering ideas with you, and not just with you, but with each other.
Prior to implementing active learning, there were people sleeping, and I don't see people sleeping in my class anymore.
I find that even students who are quiet in the rest of class, who don't contribute to discussion very much, during these simulations, almost without exception, they step forward and really jump into their roles. It's really fun.
It kind of creates this sense of belonging in the classroom, and that leads to motivation, and that's what leads to better learning outcomes.
So now that we know that active learning actually works, we have an obligation to understand that and apply it and discard traditional techniques that are now shown to be less effective.
Give me 1 second. Okay, so for me at least, and I can't speak to what you take away from that, but for me, I think a few things stick out. Is statistics back up that this is a effective method to use. The second thing that stuck out to me is, especially, I mean, we really preach at PFF being inclusive with how we teach. And this is a really effective way to reach all of your students. So it's really worth engaging yourself in a bit and becoming familiar with techniques that can help you promote a more inclusive environment. And lastly, I don't want this to turn into a dichotomy, suggesting that there's passive learning, which is bad, and active learning, which is good. That's not at all what I'm trying to say with this. It is simply that we want to be intentional about the outcomes we're trying to promote. So sometimes if I think something might be tough for students to grasp, maybe I want to do a lecture so they can get this base understanding. But if I think they can learn these activities outside of the classroom, and then we can kind of promote higher learning inside the classroom, I can use active learning strategies. So just to clarify what we mean by active learning, a lot of it, if you look at this, I think this kind of dives into it fairly well. Whereas the passive learning, you think of a classic lecture, and what we're really trying to develop here is, can someone define something? Can they explain? It's a more base level of understanding. When we're doing active learning activities, what we're really trying to promote here is, so they have the information, can they apply it? can they, and then on this it says analyze, define, create, evaluate. Those are some ways we might apply it. So I'm going to go over 3 strategies, and this is not exhaustive. So, but I think these are 3 strategies that can be effective. And the first of which is not necessarily a strategy, but a structural change you can make to your class. So essentially, a flipped classroom is, most of the time we think of, we go to class and we hear a lecture and then we're given homework to complete. Well, so what's that doing is passive learning in the classroom, and we may have more active learning activities outside of the classroom. A flipped classroom is we're just flipping that structure. So I may create a lecture or provide students with some supplemental materials outside of the classroom. And then when we come into the classroom, my time with the students will be dedicated towards promoting or applying what we've talked about. And the benefit of this, I think, so as an example, here's my favorite part of the presentation. Suppose for some reason in some alternate universe, we want to help students understand how Godzilla impacted the fashion industry. For some beautiful pictures of that, here's Godzilla in a dress, another dress, one more dress, and a wig. And now he's taken over all the models. Beautiful. So that's what we want to show students. Essentially what we do in this scenario is we would provide students with reading material or resources outside the classroom about Godzilla's tremendous impact. And then we'd kind of talk and fill in the gaps once we're in the classroom. And there's obviously numerous ways to go about active learning activities, but that is essentially what the model is. And I think what kind of best explains this in a very kind of simplistic way, that makes it easy to digest, at least for me, is if you look at this, which is Bloom's taxonomy, really what you're doing, again, in the flipped classroom model, is you're asking the students to understand and remember the content outside of the classroom, and then my resources with the students, my time with the students rather, is dedicated to the apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And that's where we suspect the most learning comes from, or I mean, really the most valuable aspect of learning comes. So I think within that, again, you don't have to do the flipped classroom for everything you teach. It's just a tool you can use that I think can be effective. And just practical suggestions that I think are worth noting. I think one of the biggest questions to come from something like this is, well, how do I keep students accountable for doing the work outside the classroom? And I think that is a question you have to figure out for yourself, depending on what you value. So you may just give them a summary, a brief summary of what you assigned. Maybe that's the way you want to go. Other things you can do is you can ask them to submit their notes through guided outlines, guided questions, and then have them submit that to you every week, just so you know they're actually doing the work outside the classroom. One common approach for supplemental material, you may be giving students or instructional videos. And I don't think this necessarily applies to, let's say, documentaries or movies, but more instructional type videos, you may want to keep that under 15 minutes or chunk them just to ensure that they're staying engaged with the material. Another thing is you don't want to assume they know how to actively watch these videos. So you may want to go or read the material you're assigning them. So I think that's where something like a guided outline or guided questions can really assist the student in knowing what to look for when they're either watching the videos or taking notes. And as I said, I don't think you don't have to use the flipped classroom model for everything. But I think a good time to use it is when there's less complex material that you assume they can kind of understand outside the classroom. And then you give that to them outside the classroom, and then that higher active learning you save for in discussion in the classroom. So a lot of this ultimately, if you do the flipped classroom model, this ultimately leads to more discussion, naturally. Online, just speaking for myself, I think it's a bit more difficult to promote discussion, at least anecdotally, online. I think part of the reason for that is it's hard to build rapport. It's just more difficult than it is in the classroom. To counter that, I think something you can do is simply providing students with more structure and clear expectations, clear guidelines, and a clear purpose to why are we having the discussion. So really, what does that look like? I mean, those are kind of vague guidelines. I think what this looks like ultimately is there's specific techniques you can use that may be helpful to implement when you want to promote group discussion. And I have, at the end of this webinar, there's some resources about different group discussion techniques that you may find valuable or you may find useless, totally up to you, but I suggest taking a look at it. But just a few, I mean, breakout rooms were mentioned by Kayla before. Those can be very helpful, and it can help a lot to give students some time to think about these things before we come back into a group discussion and go over it. So they're not just shooting from the hip. Discussion boards. So I actually saw this is commonly used. Interestingly, I came across some research that said the teacher may not want to get involved in the discussion board, but leave that for peer-to-peer interaction. The natural question is why? So what this study found was that essentially when the teacher gets involved in the discussion board, students end up responding to the teacher and not their other students. So that's something to keep in mind. And just think about that if that's a route you choose to go. That's a good place to promote peer-to-peer discussions. Is you may want to take a step back a bit. Socratic seminar, very popular. It was implemented when I was an undergrad all the time, and Socrates is pretty cool. So modeling stuff after him is a good move always. Philosophical chairs. This is something I'm kind of a sucker for. I like this. So if you want to promote critical thinking, we're breaking people up into specific philosophies, and then they have to promote philosophical stances. So I've done this when I've taught research methods. We talk about ethics a lot. What is ethical research and what isn't ethical research? And I do this with my students, and it's been very effective when I have utilized that. And as I said, there are a host of different kind of techniques you can use. These are a few, but the overall theme here is that if you want to promote group discussion, I think especially online, you want to provide clear guidelines and a clear purpose of what students will do. Or, another thing is intentionally try to build community in your classroom, which you should always be doing. But I think where that really helps is group discussions, because people will just feel more comfortable sharing out. So another technique that I want to talk about, and this is another beautiful video for everyone, is problem-based learning, which was mentioned in the chat before. And so this is 5 minutes. So we're going to quickly watch this, and then I will be right back with you.
Problem-based learning in less than 5 minutes, I promise. In the 1980s, somebody decided that haircuts were way too messy. So they combined the hair trimmer and the vacuum cleaner, and we ended up with the Flowbee. And I remember begging my parents for a Flowbee, and they said no, because they thought I would use it on the dog, and they were probably right. But the idea there is pretty clear. that you can solve problems in unique ways. And that's the core idea of problem-based learning. Number one, the need for problem-based learning. School exists in a one-size-fits-all factory model where students are expected to passively consume content. But here's the thing, kids aren't widgets, and one-size-fits-all is great for socks but lousy for minds. Kids need to dream and wonder and imagine. They need to design and build and tinker, and they need to think critically and solve complex problems. For years, the model has involved going to school, being compliant, getting into college, and then climbing the corporate ladder. But the ladder is now a maze, and our students need to know how to navigate the complexity of a global society. In other words, students need to be empowered to solve real-world problems. And that's why we have problem-based learning. Number two, the history of problem-based learning. Problem-based learning began at Case Western University in the 1950s, although it wasn't called that at the time. And the goal was to provide real-world problems for medical students to solve. It soon spread to other medical schools and eventually made its way into business, law, engineering, and education. And by the 1960s, you could find elements of problem-based learning within the new social studies framework of Macialis and Cox, as well as Herbert Thielen's group investigation model. Problem-based learning fits well within the social family of education because of the emphasis on real-world problems and human systems. It's not surprising that many of the problem-based learning theorists cite John Dewey's notion of democratic education, as well as Paulo Freire's concept of critical pedagogy. In other words, kids need to be engaged with solving problems within their world. And here's the description of problem-based learning. There are 4 different phases. Number 1, you present or identify the problem. In some cases, the teacher decides on the problem. In other cases, individual students or the entire classroom community presents the initial problem. Phase number 2, they develop a plan for solving the problem. Here, students work collaboratively in this phase where they figure out what they will do in order to solve the problem. In some cases, it's a really small plan of action, but sometimes they might engage in research, brainstorming, and ideation. And in a few cases, they might even decide to build a product. The next phase is the implementation of the plan. In this phase, students test out their plan to see if they can solve the problem. And then finally, they move to the last phase where they evaluate the implementation. Here, students analyze the results and they also reflect on the process. Now, here's the ideal context for problem-based learning. Problem-based learning works best when students solve authentic real-world problems. Math teacher Dan Meyer warns against solving problems that contain pseudo-context, where students solve problems that don't actually reflect the way the world exists. So it's important that the problems feel real to the students. In social studies, students might broker peace in a war simulation. In math, they might determine the most efficient route for a trip. In language arts, they might figure out if a novel should be adapted into a movie. And in science, they might do a science fair project. But the key idea here is that it is not project-based learning, it's problem-based. And that's because you don't have to design a product. You're simply solving a problem. Ideally, students will solve problems that actually exist in their own world. And here's where the technology comes in. Our devices have a slew of apps that once required additional time and resources. And the problem-based learning provides a model that taps into both the connective and creative capacity of technology so that students can access the tools and the information to solve these real-world problems. So that is basically problem-based learning in less than 5 minutes. Problem-based learning in...
That's a no. Okay. So, I wish I got a lot more of this in high school because it would have made my experience far more enjoyable. So essentially what you're doing with problem-based learning, I think this is really effective if you can implement it well. We're giving someone an issue, and then we're almost working back. Well, how do you solve it? And what we're doing is we're filling in the gaps. So, for example, when I teach research methods, I may give them a hypothesis someone might be interested in. So, does 8 hours of sleep improve my test scores? That's all the students will know. And then I'll ask them to design a study about what that would look like. And naturally, they're going to miss some key points, okay? Because they might not have all the information. But when I fill in the gaps about where their knowledge is missing, it tends to make sense to them. They have a real issue to try to fix, and it's very effective to let them work through it and then jump in to assist them when they don't have all the pieces. I think, it takes some forethought on your end to kind of identify problems that are not just that are problems, but also problems that are relevant to your students. But in terms of active learning techniques, I think this is arguably one of the most effective routes you can go. So to go back to Godzilla's fashion prowess, suppose that Godzilla is really upset that no one is acknowledging how skilled he is in fashion. So the issue ends up being, so Godzilla destroyed New York because school textbooks never mentioned her influence on fashion. Now she's demanding that you rewrite a textbook that adequately explains the fashion industry prior to her arrival and what occurred afterwards. If it isn't accurate, she'll destroy every major city in the United States. Essentially, this would lead to students researching the information on their own and creating a timeline for fashion. And this is just one absurd example to provide students. I suggest you probably don't ask them to do that, because I don't think Godzilla really did much for the fashion industry, but he looks good to me. So last, just as an overview, as a summary of kind of what I've talked about, during online courses, try to spend class time focusing on higher end learning. I think you'll have benefits for you. The flipped classroom is kind of one structural change that you can make to facilitate the process. And then within that, you're going to have more discussions. So building rapport and giving students with clear guidelines and clear structure should help that foster better discussion. And then, really problem-based learning is a really, really effective technique, I think. So it's something to really give some thought to and see if you can implement it. And then also in my research, I came across just most common complaints I saw were in online teaching, to be specific, was Zoom fatigue and unclear expectations. So just whatever you do online, some things to keep in mind is that provide students with frequent breaks just so you can ensure engagement. And also have a backup, to be inclusive, we have to account for people who can't get online. Do you have an asynchronous option for them? Do you have something to account for those individuals? And transparency in your design or in your course design is always important, but it becomes especially important online. So be transparent about your course design. Rubrics, have those well thought out. Do you understand why you're teaching a topic? Like, a lot of this is self-understanding as well. And that especially comes through in something like problem-based learning, where what are the real problems that what you're teaching can solve? Co-create the space with students. And then I think something to keep in mind certainly is feedback becomes more important than ever. When I say co-create the space with students, is part of this is getting feedback and seeing what the students need. So lastly, you can find these slides at the bit.ly link, and I can post that in the chat. if you have any specific questions about how to implement these techniques in your own class, you can set up an appointment with us and we'll be happy to help. So you can find that at that link below. And then lastly, so when I was talking about the technique, the resources, especially this Harvard, so the classroom discussion strategies are here. This Harvard link is, like I said, really I think fantastic. It has every kind of discipline and specific activities within that discipline. So it is very comprehensive. And there's another one below. I told you you'd probably get out early. My students tend to love that. I don't know if you do. Have lunch, enjoy your day. That's all I have, but I will be here for as long as you guys need if you guys want to discuss anything else. And thank you for attending.